So in the last video, we learned about the basics of CSS, and the video before that we did HTML. So obviously we're trying to build up to the point where we now are making an actual website. And a lot of you have started to ask, when are we going to do the server work in terms of the, Falsetto Word server? That is coming, but in order to do that, you first need to know basic web development. So we're building up to that, and we're starting with effectively a static website. So you know how to now make HTML files, and you know how to make CSS files, and they're the two main UI technologies for the website. The third really being like JavaScript. But the thing is, you don't really want to work in HTML directly. You don't want to work in CSS directly. They're not really powerful enough, or they are, but when you start getting to scale, it's nicer to have better tools to enable you to work cleaner and more methodically, and just bringing the power of, it's the difference between writing, say, a C# code file in Notepad versus Visual Studio. So you want some more power to, your design flow. So you wouldn't typically get into Sass, SASS, until you know a lot more about the web. So typically you'd know how to build websites before you looked at using Sass. But honestly, it's that simple and that easy. We're starting off with it straight away. So we've done one basic intro to CSS, and that's all you need to know and understand in order to use Sass. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to get going with a whole setup of how we, make use of Sass, how we compile the code, starting from installing. In short, Sass is basically something that compiles the Sass code into a CSS style sheet based on the content you enter, and it's very similar to CSS. You basically are writing CSS. It just adds benefits such as being able to declare variables, functions, and including multiple files nicely, and organizing things to output a CSS file, things you can't do in CSS. So we'll start by installing Sass. So as you might expect, you basically type in SASS into Google, or you can just go to sass-lang.com, go to install, scroll down and click Ruby installer, and then click this download here and install Ruby for Windows. So I've gone with the 64-bit. Simply download and install Ruby. Once that's finished, that takes quite a while. Then you can read down here, then you type gem install Sass. So basically pick a folder, go anywhere, click in the address bar here, type cmd for command, and that will open a command prompt. Or you can simply open a command prompt however you like. And then in here, if you've installed Ruby, you should be able to type gem and press enter, and it gives you this information about gem, so you know gem's installed. And then you basically type this command, gem install Sass. And I've already got it in the system, but I'll rerun it to show you what should happen. I'm pretty sure this will simply figure out that I've got it and say it's successfully installed, which it is doing. So you should see something similar to this happening. Once you've done, in the same command window, you should be able to type sass-v for version, and you can see we're running Sass version 3.5.2. So that's all there is to installing Sass, and then we want to now start using it. So I've created this folder. There'll be a link in the description. It's on my GitHub YouTube repo. I've gone into here, made another folder called 03 Sass Basics, and I've created a subfolder called webroot. And this is where we're now storing a HTML file. So in order to work with any other website stuff we're doing, we'll use Visual Studio Code. So I'll open up Visual Studio Code. And then once in here, this is the HTML file I've got. I've just made up some random HTML here to get us going so we can see it styling and things. So in here now, go to File, Open Folder instead of Open File. And go to Sass Basics, or the folder you're in, and I'll just open this folder. And that just gives us the benefit of having this drop down here now for all the files in that folder. And we've obviously got the index open. So once you've got this index open, or any HTML, you can simply make your own. It's not a video on HTML, it's the video on Sass. So I've simply copy and pasted some random HTML into here. In order to, we did this in the last video as well, to see like live edits. You want to go to extensions in Visual Studio Code and make sure you've got live server installed. If you don't, simply type it in the search bar and then click install. Once you've got live server installed, then once you've got the HTML file open, you'll see down here at the bottom right, you've got go live. If you click that, it will now open a website up. I'll drag this to one side. And you can see this is the random HTML I've made. If I make a change to the title and save, you can see live updates. So we've been through this in the previous video if you want more details on setting up to this stage. So now we have a website up, HTML. We saw how we linked in CSS before. We just simply do a link with a href to a path to some CSS, and that will then style the document. Now, instead of CSS, we're going to make Sass. Obviously, that's what we're here to do. So in this folder 03, I've got something called web root, and I've done that because this is more of a compiled folder, if you will. This is where the compiled code is going to go to. So Sass is going to compile into CSS, and it's going to go into this folder. But you don't want to mix your compiled code with your, your interpreted code, your Sass, and whatever else we use. So for that reason, we'll have two folders. You can kind of think of web root as your bin folder in C#, kind of a compiled folder. That's what we're using this for. It's going to output the final web code that we want. So what we're going to do is make a folder called source, and that's for our source code. And in the source folder, we'll make one called Sass. And then finally in the Sass folder, we'll just make a new text document here, and we'll call it style.scss. So that's the extension for Sass files. So instead of making a text document, we simply deleted the .txt extension and added .scss to make a new Sass sheet. And then we can open this in Visual Studio Code. You'll notice because we open the folder, you can see we've now got the source folder. We can open the Sass, and then here's an empty file. So we just typed in some, I don't know, H1, let's style a header 1, and make font size 50 pixels, make it massive and save. You can see right now nothing happens. So it's just a Sass file. It doesn't, this is the file we want to get. We want to include a CSS file. So how do you get from SCSS to a CSS file? So to do that, you'd go to your folder. So if we go to the main folder where we've got all our content here, so the source code with the Sass in is in here, and then the output, because we've got this index here, and the way I'm going to include my CSS file, completely up to you where you place the file. You can place it in the same folder. I'm going to put mine in a folder, as you can see, called assets. So inside web root, let's make a folder called assets. Inside that, I want to make one called CSS. And again, this is completely up to you. This is just the way I structure my websites where I place files. And then I want now my CSS to go into this folder here. So let's just jump back, get to the top folder. And if I then type in the command line here, in the address bar rather, type cmd, this opens up a command line into this folder. And then all we want to do is watch this folder for changes. And we'll start with that. So you type sass -- watch space and then dot for the folder, meaning this folder. So the dot means, this folder. And then press enter. And you can see Sass is watching for changes. Right, source, Sass, style. So if we now go into our source folder, Sass, you can see it's actually made the CSS file for us. And you'll see in here, we can see it automatically. So if we open it up, you can see it's compiled our SCSS file, which is right now just CSS anyway, and compiled it into a CSS file for us. So that's already working, if you will. If we were to delete these files, so we've just got the SCSS file, and we make a change, you'll see before I save, if I move that over to there, this down to here, if I save this SCSS now, you'll see that this detected changes, and then created the CSS file for us. So we've already got the Sass now compiling, but it's compiling to the wrong place. So let's delete those two again. In this terminal where Sass is running, press Control-C to terminate the Sass, and then it'll say confirm, yes. And then we're going to run that same command again, but this time, the first dot is the input folder. Well, if we're up here, this isn't really, we don't want to be watching this whole folder. We want to just be watching the Sass folder. So instead of dot, we'll type source /sass, which will basically mean watch this folder for the file changes. That's all we want to watch. If you then put a colon, it will now mean the first one's the input folder, next one's the output folder. Well, the output folder we want to go into webroot assets CSS. So we'll type webroot assets CSS. And now you can see it's written, it's instantly wrote the CSS file when we opened, and it's also put into the correct location for us now. So if we opened this folder, this file, that is showing, just need scrolling up, there we go. It's this file. So if we split that again, maximize a minute, this is the CSS file, and this is the Sass file. So if I then change this to font size 60 and save, and then watch over here, you can see the files got updated. So we've got kind of a live compilation going on right now. We can simply write SCSS, and this CSS file will get updated. So that should also mean, if we then watch the website here, we should be able to live change the SCSS and see the HTML changing. So to do a quick recap of where we're up to at the minute, we've downloaded and installed Sass. We've made a webroot folder where we've just simply placed this HTML file. And then we've made a source folder, and inside that Sass and inside this SCSS file. Right now there's just plain old CSS in there. And then we've ran the CMD in this 03 Sass Basics folder to pop up a command line. And then in that, it popped up and we typed in Sass and then space, 2 dashes, watch, space, and then the path that we want to watch, which is source/Sass, and then the output path of where we want the files to be generated. So right now, this is the command you'd have to run in order to effectively start watching for Sass file changes. In the next video, I'll show you a tool I've made, so you don't need to do this. But for this first video, it's perfectly fine. And now with that running, and with the live server inside of Visual Studio running, we have effectively a live link where we can edit files. And this asset CSS file here gets auto-generated every time we make a change. The index file we've got then links to that CSS file here, and that's why we're now getting the ability to change that. So that's give us really the environment setup, of where we want to be. So now you'll want to know what the benefits of Sass are, and we'll go through. I've called this a Sass Basics, but really we're going to cover almost everything. There's going to be very few things we won't cover in this video. So we'll get started with the most basics. So one is similar to, again, C# and coding. Say you were making a load of CSS and you had, a bunch of headers, and you wanted them all to be, say, different, or say for one you wanted them all to be the same, and this is how you're doing it: 80 pixels, 80 pixels, 80 pixels. Now I know in CSS you could do H1, H2, H3, combine them this way, and then place your value here. But this is just an example of one situation where in CSS you have no variables. There's no way to share data. There's no way to, keep things common. So if you had headers with the same font size, and then you had, say, a box class, and that had some color of red, and then it also wanted a font size the same, you're constantly repeating yourself. There's no way to have variables, and that's what you really need when you're writing any kind of large CSS file. So the first way to do a variable is, well, the only way to do a variable is $, and then the name of your variable. So we'll call this header-size, a colon, and then we'll do, say, 40 pixels. And now all you do to use that variable, that's like declaring a variable in C#. So that's similar to going var header size, and I know you can't do a dash in C# for a variable name, but presume you could. It would be basically this. That's what you're doing. You're creating a variable, giving it a name, and setting it to 40. It's just in Sass, you do $ to define a variable, then the name, then a semicolon, and then the value after that name. So now we have a variable called header size with a value of 40 pixels. So now instead of hard coding values here, we can simply paste in the name of the variable. And if we save that, you'll see it's now changed there. And if we also open the CSS, you can see it's compiled to basic CSS, which doesn't have variables, but it's simply inserted the variable where we like. And then we can make use of that anywhere we like. So we can change that to the header too as well. Make use of the variables. So again, that's all there really is to a variable. You define it and you use it where you want. So we'll say nothing more on that really. What we're going to try and do in this video is start creating the correct structure as well for a larger website, for a full website. So in order to, and I guess the point of Sass as well is to organize those files. So we're going to move into slightly organizing these into the correct structure. And again, this is my preference. This is how I structure things. You're free to structure the files however you like, but I'll show you my way. So we'll go into the source folder, and then we've got Sass. And right now we've just got one file called style.scss. We want to kind of make a base system, which I'll end up making a full-blown base system to share on GitHub once it gets more mature. But we really want a base web system where we have base sizes, a theme, some normalization, a grid system for responsive and mobile web design, all kinds of foundations to building a website, all the stuff that goes into the basics of every website. We want to kind of make a base for that. So what we're going to do, instead of having everything in this one file, similar again to C# having multiple classes and multiple files and including them everywhere, one of the features of Sass is that you can include things in another file. So let's just right click and create another file. And this we'll call base.scss. And then all we'll do for now is we'll open this base.scss. We'll move this header size into this base and we'll save. And the first thing you'll notice is in webroot assets CSS, it's now generated this base.css. Well, we don't want to really generate loads of CSS files and then include them all in the HTML. Because for one, that means that you have more web requests when you open your page, which slows down your load time. And two, it's we just don't need individual CSS files. We can quite happily compile into a single file because this isn't the file we have to maintain or view or anything. This is simply the compiled version, if you will, of the Sass. So we want it in one file, but we still want to separate our actual files. So to do that, we can make what's called a partial class. And in Sass, a partial class can be easily defined by simply placing an underscore in the name. And now that's been edited. We can see that in here. New template detected Sass underscore base. So basically that should now have not generated anything in here for the base, which is correct. So we're not getting a file for that class. But now the base file contains our variable. We want to make use of it in this style class. So this is a partial class now, this base underscore. And we want to include it in this style file now. So to do that, you type @import, and then in quotes, end with a semicolon, type base. And what you don't need to do when you're doing an import is you don't need to specify an underscore. So you can, but you don't need to. And you also don't need to specify .scss. So you could import this, you could import this, you could import this. They'll all work. But in general, don't bother putting an underscore because you don't need to. And there's no point putting .scss because it's smart enough to know that. So by doing import base, we should now have the ability to reference this header size. So we save that. It's now generated. If we go back to webroot assets CSS, I don't know why I keep doing that. It's right here. You can see it's 40. Now if we change the base to 50 and save, then the Sass has detected that that's changed. It also knows that style is referencing there, and now the style's changed. So that is a partial class, and also importing it into this main class. So because our base class is going to have a lot more than this one file, we're going to be splitting it up. Let's make a folder in here and call it base. And we'll just move this base into here. And then if we edit the style, you'll see right now this should fail because it can't find that import now. So what it's doing now is looking for a base.scss file in this folder, and it doesn't exist. It's gone inside of a folder called base. So we now need to go inside the folder called base and then to the file called base. And now it's found it again. So we have that. We want to now create one of the things, then this isn't really related to Sass directly, it's more CSS and web design in general. And again, this is my preference, so I'm sure many other web designers do things differently, but I strongly feel that websites should have a base sizing in terms of everything to form sort of aesthetically pleasing design comes from, you know, a certain figure. So everything's kind of branches off. That's kind of like the golden ratio and Fibonacci and things like that. Natural aesthetics come from an association and a link between elements. So this heading, as you can see, has got, say, this much space above, this much space below, but hardly any here. But if we move this out, it'll start looking nice. Your eye should be able to see that this header looks too close to the left-hand side. You can't say why. You just know that it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. And if we move it out a certain amount, then all of a sudden you can tell it looks nice, it fits. And then what you'll find is the difference, or rather the similarity between, you know, the space above and the space to the left is a direct proportion, and everything should size proportionally. So say the top is 100 pixels and the left you want to be 50, and it's a 50%, you know, ratio of a certain value. So when I design websites, I make absolutely everything in the website follow a few small base variables, base sizes. And then if everything follows from those sizes, your entire website can scale up and down by changing a single value. So that's what we're going to do here now. We're going to start creating this kind of base structure and these base values, because you need to start with good foundations. So this might be, you know, in advance, and it probably is in advance of where your skill level might be at if you're just learning CSS and Sass. But this is the best way to do it, is to, you know, start with the right foundations. So what we're going to do, you've seen how to make a variable in Sass. You've seen how to make a partial file like base. So we're going to now make another one. It's still part of really this base system that we're making. We'll call it _base.settings.scss. And then inside of the base folder, we've got a new file now. And we can do comments in SCSS, just the same, like C#. So we'll just call it base settings as kind of a header. And then here, we'll say this is high-level settings for the entire site. To create relational sizing and aesthetically pleasing design, something like that. So in here now, we'll make a variable called base spacing unit, say, and we'll give that a value. So we'll give that a value of, or let's do a, say, 24 pixels. And you can adjust these to anything you like. You know, we've got a few things, like I say, that are going to form the foundation, and everything else will size from that. We'll create another one called base font size, which again is kind of the default middle ground font size we want to work off. And then we'll create another one, finally, base line height, which is the space between, you know, these two lines of text. And for that, we'll actually only make use of the spacing anyway. So we'll make use of the same variable. So this is actually setting the value of this variable to what this variable is. So really, our entire site now is going to be based off these two sizes alone. So absolutely everything in the whole UI design is going to come from these two sizes. And you'll see that coming about in the next few videos. So to make use of these sizes, you don't have, you know, everything isn't 24 pixels and everything isn't 16 pixels. That's not what I'm saying. It's that everything is a derivative of those sizes. So things like padding and spacing between elements. So there's white space around here, and the padding and the spacing. You need sizes to work from for that. So we'll do spacing sizes, and then here we'll make a whole bunch of them. So we'll say spacing normal, and that value will be the base spacing unit, and that's fine. And then if we copy and paste that as well as normal, you might want to be less than that. And you don't want too many, so don't go crazy on them, because you kind of defeat the point. If there's too many steps in between, you've simply made a value for every item. So for small, we'll do half of that size. Oh. And then we'll do one that says smaller. That's a third of that size. And then you can go above as well. So you'll notice in Sass as well, obviously here, I'm doing mathematical equations. So I'm dividing by 3, I'm dividing by 2. That's something you also can't do in CSS. So you're gaining the benefit of using, math operations. So as well as spacing normal, we'll do spacing large. And large can be, say, times 1.5. We'll do larger, which will go to, say, 2. And then we'll do largest, which will go to, say, 3. So what we have here now is a bunch of spacings that we can make use of in our design, but are all a percentage of this base spacing unit. So you'll see this come together, like I say, but now we have some units to go off. Then the same goes for fonts. So we want font sizes, and you want font normal, which I'm pretty sure you can guess where this is now going to go. It's kind of exactly the same. So you make a normal size, you'll make a small, and that'll be divided by say 1.3. Again, these you can play with these figures once you see your website up and running and tweak them until they're nice. We'll do an extra small, and that can be divided by, say, 1.6, because you don't want fonts being too small, because they're already, your standard base font is about legible anyway, so you don't want to go crazy small. And then we'll do font large, and that one can be times, say, 1.5, and then we'll do larger, largest, similar fashion. And we'll do 2 and 3 times. So same as spacing, we have base font sizes now as well to work off. We can also do, this isn't really the same thing as these universal spacings, but let's also define, while we're on the fonts, the font weight, which is the thickness. Like this is kind of bold, this is thinner. So we'll make font weights light, and we'll simply define the font weights, and we'll probably move this, in fact no, because this is settings, this is fine. So font weights are basically values from 0 to typically 1,000 at most, and on average a font weight is like 300 or 400, and like I say, it's the thickness of the character. So if you have a certain font you use for the website and you make the font weight thicker, and if there's a bold version of the font that's weight is set as that number or above, then it'll go to that thickness. So we'll use these, but I'll just plonk these in for now, so you can we have them in the settings file for completeness. So we'll have a light font, which will be like a thin font. A normal font, we'll say 200 for now. We'll probably change that. We'll have a bold font, which I don't think will be 300, but again, let's just chuck some values in until we pick a font. Then we'll match these up. And we'll have black, which is like really fat, let's say 500. So we've got some font weights in there. And then we'll do, we'll now style or rather we won't style these, we'll style them in a minute, but we'll also need base sizes for headings, I feel. Because headings are used quite intensively throughout the website. They'll be different from font sizes in general. You'll want to specify specific sizes for, headers. So we'll do header sizes. and we will do header size, and we'll make these match the HTML H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we'll do header size 1. And again, making use of the base font size that we have. We'll make the biggest header, say times 1.7. And then we copy and paste this, so we've got 6 of them. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the larger the number on the header, the smaller they get. So we'll do times 1.6. 1.5, 1.3, do normal size font, so the heading's now the same size as the font, and then we'll even do a heading that's actually smaller than the font size for whatever we might need. And I think that's really it for all of this base unit. So all we've done here in Sass is define a load of variables, but now they're usable throughout our file. So we now want to make use of these, or start making use of these. So we go to the folder again. We've got the settings, which is where, you will really be to just tweak the settings of the website, the UI, the default sizes and things. We'll make another file called base dot, what shall we call this? Or do we even need another file for this? Because this is making use of base sizes. No, I think we'll place this in base itself. So that's kind of the root level of this this base system, because it's kind of important now. We want to apply these settings to certain specific. This is just generalized things. So we want to say make use of the line height that we specified for the whole document. So for base, you can think of this as the top level of this base system. So normal CSS, you type body to access all of the stuff inside the body. We'll do line height. And now we'll make use of the variable, which we call base line height. And if we save that, I believe this won't work yet because we haven't imported. But if we save that file, you can see we've got error undefined variable. And that's because we need to do the import in this file. We need to import base settings. So do @import base.settings. And here, I think that should work. Invalid body expected. Oh, sorry. And then a semicolon. So there we go. Change detected. Undefined size, header size. Ouch. Where have I used header size? Style, in here, in the old style. So let's just delete that for the minute. There we go. So where were we? The base now has body line height, base line height. Style imports base, and base imports the settings. So the end result is our CSS has been generated, and now we have this body line height of 24. And then visually, if we went to settings now and changed our base spacing unit, say to 29, you can see we're separating the line height. So we went to like 40. You can see it in use. But what you'll see is that everything, sizes in proportion. So we'll make use of line height here. Set the default line height. Same for the font weight. So we'll set the font weight to font weight normal. And that doesn't really change anything here because this font that we're using right now, the standard one, doesn't really change. You can try changing font normal to... Where's our font weight light gone? I thought we made a light one. So if you change font weight normal to 900, you can see at least it's picked a bolder font here. But again, until we pick a font in a minute, we'll mess with these values to match afterwards. And then you can see the output here. So we now have our base settings starting to be used to create some kind of standard appearance and layout. We also made the headers. So let's apply these header styles. So let's do H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And we want all of them, so all these headers we'll want to have the font weight set to a font weight for heading. Which did we make like a font weight for heading? No. So as well as these font weights, you kind of want to make some default ones for, you know, what fonts are going to be used for the heading. And again, we won't use a new value. We'll simply set it to a certain thing. So headers are typically bold, you know, so we'll set it to the variable bold. And then in order to change the font weight of all headers, you simply change this one variable. So back in the base here, we'll set the font weight to the bold, and you can see our bold right now is set to 300, which is not bold enough. But, you know, the default one is actually bolder, so ours have gone thinner, which is fine. So set heading font weights. And again, you can always keep an eye out on the CSS to see what's happening. Because at the end of the day, all we're doing is creating multiple classes and organizing our CSS into Sass files and making use of variables to, you know, to make our lives easier. So we've got some kind of system in place. But ultimately, it all ends up compiling to bog standard CSS. So if you're curious of what's happening, you can always just keep an eye on the CSS file. You know, and you'll know what's going on. So we've set the font heading, set line heights, set default font weights. And then what else did we have? We had this specific sizes for headings as well. So to do that, we'll have H1 and we'll have font size, font, what was it, heading size 1, I think. Undefined variable heading size 1, header size 1. So you might not see that change. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's apply that to all the header sizes. And save, and you can see they've slightly changed there. If we go to the header sizes, we can either say make this one a lot larger by timesing it by 3, and you get a larger heading. Or you could change, if you wanted everything to scale at the same proportion. Why is this the same size, or does it just look the same size? Yeah, it just looks the same size. So heading 1 and 2 are pretty similar, so I'm going to actually beef up heading 1 a little bit more, probably shrink that down a little bit more. Something like that. They scale a bit better now. That can go. So now you can see all the outputs have been calculated as well. So the CSS has got, you know, set sizes in pixels, and they've been calculated. So in here we've done it via variables. But elsewhere we've, you know, once it compiles, it's gone to, you know, your standard values. So before we go much further as well, let's put a nice font into this website. So if I close this down, go to fonts.google.com, and this is where you can get any kind of font you like for your website. So if I turn off my style sheet processing, you can see you'll get a load of fonts. So really popular ones like Open Sans, Roboto and Lato, they're all really common. So I've looked through one, I wanted one slightly different. So if you search, if you want to copy off mine, and type Quicksand, and we're going to use this font. So to use it, you just click the plus button. It'll go to a thing down here, added. And then you've got Quicksand selected. Go to customize, and we want to have the options here to, you know, select these fonts. And you can see we have, these are the weights we were talking about: light, regular, medium, and bold. So if we go to our settings file a minute and just tweak these to match. So light would be 300, Regular would be 400. Medium, as they've called it, we've called it bold, is 500. And black, they're calling bold, we'll call 700. So if we make our font weights match this, and now we have all these selected, go to embed, and it tells us we need to include this link in the, effectively the CSS link there. So to do that, instead of having, you know, a link just like this that we have to, you know, keep, you have to then put that into your HTML, we'll use this import instead, so we can use it directly in Sass. You want to copy just this part, so ignore the style around there, and copy this, and then we just need to paste this into a Sass file. So again, to keep things nice and clean and organized, we'll make another file called base.fonts. And again, it might look like you're making a lot of files here to store small things, but trust me, this is going to benefit you as this site grows, because you can keep things nice and organized, and you're not going to go, right, where did I store that string for the fonts? If you just got one file called base and then it's a 10,000 line Sass file and you're hunting around for things, keeping things separate and in small files is really good practice. So we made another file called base.fonts. In here we'll paste what it told us to include, which is this import function. This is just plain CSS, so it's not actually, even though it's an @import and it looks the same as this import, this is not a Sass import, this is a bog standard CSS. And then once we've done the import, we need to set the font family to quicksand to get that font. So in order to do that, we'll put this inside body again, so it's, you know, applied everywhere. And we'll do font family, or rather than we'll just paste. So there's the font family. And then we will just put a little note at the top. And we are using quicksand font, a smiley face. And then we will see, you can pick again any font on this site and the process is the same. Click the plus button, click the button that says family selected, customize it to make sure you include all the fonts that you want, and then go to embed, import, and, you know, do the same process. So you can easily change the fonts you want. If we go back to this site now, you can see it's still the boring old font, but we haven't included this base fonts again. So back to our base.scss file, as well as importing settings, let's import the fonts. And you can now see our website's instantly changed to a much nicer looking font. So again, like I say, pick any you like, but this is the one I'm going to use for now for this. And then next thing, I'd say the next step in the process, and again, not specific to Sass, but kind of, you know, bundle it in because we are making, you know, Sass variables and things. But when you make a website, you really want to pick at least a color theme, a color palette. And I've settled on, over making multiple websites, 5 colors tends to be a decent amount of colors in a site, and you don't really want to go more or less. So you can either have your palette made yourself, you can just pick 5 colors you like or get them to blend. But I've just tried this today, you know, for making this video. I thought, I wonder if there's any kind of nice generators for making color schemes. So Googled it, and basically Coolors, if you will, COOLORS.co, gives you this nice website. Where I maximize it a minute, you kind of get this generator. Let me just copy my code out first. In fact, I'll copy out, then I'll show you how easy it is to regenerate different schemes. But you come onto this site and you see this, and you press spacebar on this site, and these colors will all change. And you can mess with settings, like if you want them all to be the same color tone, if you will. And then you can do pick colors from an image to, you know, match, try and find a color scheme from images. Or you can click each individual one and tweak the values. So we'll have a play with this in a minute, but I've settled on these colors. So I'm going to click the export and then SCSS. And this has generated a file. So let's just open the file. Won't bother downloading it. And then in here, you can see it's made these SCSS variables. So we'll just take the RGB values, they're fine. Copy, and you can see these match the colors. And then we will add this to another file we'll make. So we will call this base.palette.scss. And we open that, paste the values in and save. We now have 5 colors to use called color 1 to 5. And we will then apply them to our site. But now I've copied them into my file. I'll show you this quickly by just doing a refresh. I think this will load the same colors again though. Yeah, so if I just do, I guess remove this GUID from this session. This is the site you'll come to. Start the generator for free. It loads this page. Then you get a bunch of colors. Now, if you press spacebar, you just generate loads of random colors that, kind of go well together. If you found one that you like say I like this yellow, I can click this lock icon and then press space, and that one won't change, but the others around it will now change. You can also say click this if that's close to what you want. You could click this to change shades and go, darker or lighter. You can click drag and just simply, depends on where you want to visualize it. And you can adjust, and then this is where you can tweak, however you like. Adjust it up or down to whatever color you like. And you got all kinds of different, ways to change the color. So it's fairly obvious how you use the site. And like I say, you can pick colors from an image, or, remote image or local image, anything you like. So I've gone with, those colors that I've found, and this is how I've picked them, just using this coolest site. So that's the color scheme picked. So now if we go to use them in this site, we have fonts to store the fonts in. The base is the parent of all this that is the effectively the base system. The settings are all the settings. Now the palette has got the colors in. So you want to keep the palette separate from the theming, because this palette is now purely 5 colors. But if you're making a theme on a website, you might want the background to be color 1, the foreground to be color 3, a header to be a different color. But where and how you apply those colors throughout your website forms the theme. The specific colors that you're applying really are separate from that. They're the palette. So you can then change just the palette on its own. So we'll have a file called base.palette for storing the colors. We'll have a file called base.theme, which really is where we start to now apply these theme settings. So in base, as well as importing fonts, let's import theme. And we can have, we'll import the palette as well, obviously. And then if we go to theme now, and as our first theme, let's make the whole of the HTML document, so even if it's a blank page, we'll make the background the variable from the palette, color 1. And you can see our website's now turned to that purple color that I picked. We'll then also set the color, which is the foreground, the font color, to color 4. And that brings it up to our kind of white light color. So now we're starting to theme the website. We've got an actual, a theme going with our colors. And you might say, right, that's 2 colors used. What about links? Like here we've got a link, and it's the standard blue that you get in browsers. So instead, let's make an anchor style. I'll say color is the 3rd color out of our theme, and it's gone to this nice blue that we had. And then we might want to hover effect over this, to go from blue to something else. So let's just zoom in. Oop, not that one, this one. So you want this blue to change. So in pure CSS, if you wanted to now style a hover effect on an anchor, you'd have to do outside here a.hover, and then we could do the color when you hover is color 2, say, and that'll work. And you can see now it goes to the bright pinky color we have, but you're in Sass now, not CSS, so you don't need to do this separation, because really what you're doing here is saying there's the style for an anchor, but then the hover style for the same thing is now had to go into a separate, almost class, if you will, when you look at it, this group. So it kind of separates your visual, and you also have to retype all this. So in Sass, you can do what's called nesting. And because this hover is related to this anchor, you can simply delete the anchor, move this inside here, and then because we want it to be, a colon hover, you put the special character ampersand, the and sign, and save, and we'll get the same thing. And again, if you look at your output, the CSS is generated. If you space it out and see, it's generated the anchor, and then it's generated the anchor hover separately. But in our theme, it's inside the same thing. And that's all just simply because of this ampersand. So all that ampersand is this means the parent that we're inside of, so it's this A. So if we made another thing here, H1, H2, H3, and we just did, fake, that's not a name, and we just did ampersand and saved. In the style, we should see now, I think it doesn't like it because I've edited that file. Let me just close that file a minute, reopen. And here you'll see fake is H1, H2, H3. So all you do when you use this ampersand is it replaces this value with the parent that you're in. So by doing ampersand colon hover, you're effectively doing a colon hover because that's what we're inside of, is the A. So this is called nesting in Sass. And like I said, the benefit of that is that instead of saying you've got an unordered list and you style it with margin of 0, and then you want the list items inside of these, you then have to do unordered list item, and then you style down here. And then if you wanted the unordered list with a list item, if it's got a div inside, you do down here. It's all this repeating ULLI, and instead of doing it individually, you can just nest inside, and it's the logical order. So now this li will cause, when we generate the CSS, it'll generate the classes for us, the standard CSS classes, but we don't have to separate them anymore. We can nest them one inside of the other. So we've done the theming, if you will. This is all we'll theme for now, because it's kind of the point of, you've got the colors, we can now use this theme file to theme whatever we want. Then we have, what else have we got? This is called a parent selector, by the way. The term for the Sass thing is called parent selector, and then going inside like this is called nesting. We can do, let's say we have this quote here. So in the, close that down, close fonts down. In the HTML, I put this block quote in. Now, typically you want a block quote to have like a left border here, like a line down it. So we will add this, I guess, directly to our style class. This is specific right now to just a block quote. So let's just chuck it in here. So we'll do something, let's say, where shall we put this? I think in here is fine, yeah. So we'll just do normal CSS again, block quote, and we'll do border left is 2 pixels solid, and then we can make use of the color directly here. So let's pick, say, I don't know, color 3. That's a blue, color 2. Let's go with that kind of pinky color. And again, we've made use of the theme, but directly in our style class, the uppermost one. So this style class would be specific to each website. So you can reuse this base system, and then this is now my specific, say, Angel 6 website. So I can still use all the theme colors where I like by just importing the base system. And that's kind of the point of that. And then we'd also have some padding left. And remember, we don't want to ever type values directly. Now we want to make use of the spacing system. So we had spacing unit normal, I believe that was a value. Nope. What did we call it? Spacing, oh, not unit, just spacing normal. So we did say spacing normal. You can see then we get this size here. And that gives a space. So there wasn't really much point in that. I just wanted to put a colored line there and kind of show that you can use the variables in other places. So let's do, I guess, one more example of nesting. Let's just make, say, a box class that we want to box something in. So I think I've already tagged a random thing with box. So here we've got rounded box. Let's say box. So we've put this paragraph's now got a class called box. So in here you just do box again, normal CSS. You'd have background. Again, let's make use of the theme. Color theme. So now we've got this blue background. We'd have some padding. Again, making use of the spacing system. Put some normal spacing in. You can now see, even though we've defined spacing normal, and the left, top, right, and bottom padding should be the same, you can clearly see the top and bottom are bigger. And that's because a paragraph by default has padding already at the top and bottom. So what we can do here, we can nest inside of box, and we can say the direct descendants, as we went through in the CSS video, the children directly inside of box. If they're a paragraph, then we will make, say, the padding 0. And that didn't work. It's not the padding, is it? It's the margin. Come on. Margin. And there you go. Now you can clearly see you've got this same appearance outside. So already you should start to see, things are matching in terms of space, and they start to look correct. And that's where, as soon as this website grows and we start doing things, sticking to this spacing system, really helps. So that's just another example of nesting, exactly the same as what we've done, just so you get more of a feel. And again, you can always look at the CSS and take a look at the fact that it makes it look like it's nested just because it indents. But if you put a space along and tab back in, you can see it's creating the standard CSS and doing that for us, doing the longer winded versions of CSS for us. Then we have, let's say we want to make a rounded box here. We can use something in Sass that's called a mixin, and it's pretty much like a function. It's not as such a function, because we'll get onto functions in a minute, but it's similar to a function. So in order to style this box, and let's make rounded corners, we would have, say, rounded box, and I guess we'll jump to another function or another thing in Sass just now, because it's easy to explain. Say you wanted to have a rounded box that is kind of, again, if we make it similar to C#, this is like your base class, and this wants to now implement the base class. It wants to inherit from box and simply add rounded borders to this style. So again, in CSS, there's no way to do that directly. You'd have to kind of make both of them the same up here and do, rounded box and give them both the same name. And then in rounded box below separately, you'd add your rounded borders. But again, we're in Sass, so we don't need to be messy. We can simply say this rounded box extends. So you type in at extends, or at extend rather, and then the name, which is .box, and a semicolon. And now this will inherit all of these styles. And now we can simply tag on the rounded border to that style. So you can type in border radius, and let's say, let's do the spacing normal again. And you can see here we don't have the rounded border. And this is because this value is, because it's not mainstream CSS as such. It's, as new features get introduced, then you have to, they come out and get added. Or rather, this one will work because it's fairly modern. If we just change the class to rounded box in the HTML, you'll see the rounded corners. But when it's a certain thing like these border radius, as they get released, in order to support older versions, so like, certain versions of IE or older versions of Firefox or anything like that, they have what's called a vendor prefix. And that allows each browser developer to, implement their own version of this with a specific prefix. So instead of typing border radius, technically, to support all the browsers, you should have a vendor prefix. So you should have basically dash WebKit, which I think is Apple's, and then you should have dash Moz for Mozilla, which is for this Firefox. And then you should have dash MS for Internet Explorer. And then finally, once it gets fully released, you have your standard border radius. So these are kind of the specific implementations. So I don't know whether this will work with the already supporting border radius because it's fallback. But let's say I remove this border radius, the hard-coded one. Now this Mozilla one would be divided times 2. We should see for Mozilla, which it's not doing here, that it would go to twice the border radius. See if I can get it to force that. Oh, there we go. So WebKit looks like it's using the WebKit prefix here. Or is it because of simply order of precedence? Let's swap them around. No, so this is actually using the WebKit prefix. And I am in Firefox, yeah. I could have sworn Moz was the Firefox one. So the point I'm trying to get across here is basically when new features in CSS come out, if you start seeing things like this, WebKit and then a name, Moz then a name, MS then a name, it's basically called a vendor prefix. So in order to use any features that are fairly new, that haven't simply become mainstream for many years yet, you should technically do this for everyone. And you can see how much of a pain this is. Again, you're repeating effectively, all you need to say is border radius and a value, and you're repeating it 4 times, and you have to do that in CSS. So in Sass, we can get around this by making effectively like a function, and they call it a mixin, and it's to pass in what you want. So we'll pass in the word border radius, and we'll pass in the value, and then the mixin can go ahead and effectively make us all 4 of these. So if we first look at the outputted CSS, you'll see the rounded border's got what we typed, which is what we expect. But now we want to get this done through a mixin. Where have we gone? Style. So to do this, because there's a lot more places you need this vendor prefix, we'll make a mixin. So go back to our base system here and add a text file _base.mixin, or mixins, because there's going to be many of them, .css or SCSS. Include that in base again. And then in mixins, to make a mixin, you do @mixin, and then give it a name like a when you're making a function in C#. So we'll call it vendor. Open and close, make your curly brackets. So again, very similar to C#. If you want to accept any input, which we do here, well, we need 2 variables. So $sign for variable, call it property. And again, this is just simply defining 2 fields, 2 properties going into the function, if you will. And we give it this name called property, can be any name you like. And then we want one more called value. And then in here, let's close these others down. So what we want ultimately is this. Let's copy and paste this in first. So this is what we're after, but the difference is we want to, the way we'll use it in here, the way we'll call the mixin or add the mixin, you do @include and then the name of the mixin, and we give it a name vendor. So in here it would be @include vendor, open and close, and then now it's expecting, or rather if we just simply delete the properties first to show you this running. So there's a mixin called vendor, and we simply include the vendor mixin. So if we save the mixin, save the style, and then look at the CSS, you can see it's in here. So it's done the same thing. If we did times 2 here, and then look at this, you can see it's now twice the value. So all we've done is first moved it out into something called a mixin, and then pasted this CSS, and it ended up getting included in this this part of the CSS. But the difference is we want to use this for any property, so not just border radius. So the variable here, the thing that's going to change, is this border radius. That's all we're doing. We're repeating that and prefixing it with WebKit, Moz, and MS. So one of the things we want to pass in is this border radius as a variable. So we'll cut out the border radius and we'll replace it. We'll first bring in a variable. We expect something called property now. And then you'd think you'd just use it kind of like you normally do with a property or a variable. You'd type in property like this. But this is kind of a special use case. We want the value of the property itself to become part of the name that we're defining in CSS, as opposed to it being the trying to set the variable itself. So to make use of a variable directly as a name inside, we use what's called, what do they call it? I think it's interpolation, they call this one. So it'll be hash and then curly braces around the whole thing. And this really removes the quotes from the property, the string. So the property is going to come in like border radius, not because we type it like that, simply because it's coming in as a property and the type has defaulted to string. It comes in like this. So what it would try and do would be to do dash webkit dash border radius, like this. And that's obviously not valid CSS. We need to unquote, if you will. We need to get rid of those quotes so it becomes what we originally wanted, which is that. So this interpolation, basically wrapping the variable inside this, is what allows us to make use of the property we passed in. So we copy that, and you'll see it used in a second. Remove all the instances of where we type border radius and replace it with the variable property. And here it's the only one, so we replace that. We save that and it fails now because we've now got to pass in a property. So in here we'll say border radius and save. And then if we go to the outputted CSS, you can now see it's got webkit border radius, same again. But now the difference is, let's say we didn't want the border radius and we wanted the, what else is a WebKit specific thing? I don't know, make anything up. Say test and save. And then the CSS now will say WebKit test, Moz test, MS test, and test. So all it's doing for us is repeating the, that's the variable, and it's going to prefix it with the vendors, which is what we need to, like say, do certain CSS styles that need vendor prefixes. So finally, then we want to also pass in the value that's going to be included. So let's change that back to border radius. The other variable is obviously this spacing normal, which isn't necessarily always going to be spacing normal. It could be for any other property. So we'll just call this one value, and then paste that in there. And then we expect another property called value. We save that, we go back to here, and now we pass in border radius 15 pixels, say, just for now, to get it building. You can see there's the border. We save again, gets larger, and then we just change that back to now the spacing normal. So you can see that's now allowed us to create a border radius with this value, but instead of it just coming out as a single property like this, it gets exploded into adding all of the vendor prefixes. So a mixin is similar to a function, but basically you can think of it as a bunch of CSS. So this is the bunch of CSS we wanted that will get included, because we typed include, into this class that we're in. But it will simply replace these variables inside of where we make use of them inside the function. So it's kind of like a variable. It always adds the CSS. It always adds what's in here to the class when you include it. But it simply replaces the variables inside. One last thing we should do to this function to make it more usable, though, is say we had a border radius. You can specify a top, bottom, left, and right. So you should be able to do 20 pixels, 10 pixels, 50 pixels, 0 pixels to specify a different size like this. But you might also have an instance where the thing you're passing in, because it can be any CSS, it could be, I can't think off the top of my head one that would use it, but let's say we have background, this might have one, solid, I don't think you'd ever have a comma, or in fact, you might be able to have commas and it still work. But the point is, if we were to put commas in here, like this, for whenever it's a name, then it's not going to pass in because it's expecting one variable. one value coming in. But what if we need a comma in our actual variable that we're passing in? So a trick to allow that to simply pass through and add it to, dump it out here regardless, is to put 3 dots after the variable name. And this basically allows any number of variables to come into the function then. And you can see it then basically dumps out what you typed. So it allows this kind of pass-through of comments. And what it does is turn it into a list of values. So that'll now have 4 values. So inside here, you could say value. In order to access the second item, 10 pixels, as it comes in now, this is an array, if you will. This is a list. It's no longer a single item. And everywhere it hits a comma, it splits it up. So this would be the first item, the second, the third, the fourth. So in order to access the specific, item in that list, you say nth and then open parentheses, close, and you want the first item, say. And there we go. We have the first item in, this specific thing. So we don't use that directly now, but that simply allows this kind of behavior in future when we need to pass in some values to a CSS property that have comma separations in them. So you won't necessarily understand that bit yet, but that's all the ... does is kind of like the params in C#. So if you've ever done sort of public class, or not public class, public void a function, string a, and then you've done kind of params and passed in multiple, so you can, pass in as many unknown amount of properties into the function. This is kind of similar. So now, even though we say value, it can be multiple values, and it'll simply dump out, when we do this, it'll dump out all of them in a comma separated list, which is what we want, in those instances. So that is mixins. Again, you'll see us using them. So throughout this series, we'll now be using, Sass all the way through. So this video is going to go through, as many parts of Sass as I can think of. And to be honest, that's almost all of them done. And then as we now go through and make this website, I can briefly talk about what I'm doing. Like, I'm just nesting this inside of here, or I'm just extending this function. But this video covers them all initially, so you can always jump backwards. And if you wanted to know what a mixin was, you can jump back and look at this video. So this is probably going to be more of a useful video once the future videos come out in the following weeks, where you can start using it as a reference back to Sass. But there's not much in Sass at all. So there's a few more things. I'll cover one more, I think, and then the rest are really, they're not used that often, and you kind of just, we'll either just cover them as we go, or I'll do another kind of advanced video that just simply covers the advanced topics. So we've got a mixin. Let's make one more mixin. So a good thing is, where did we put the anchor style? It was in theme, wasn't it? So we do this hover effect that gives us this kind of hover color. And you can also do this keyboard tabbing supported on your side. See how we can tab? So all I did was kind of dragged and selected text and pressed tab on the keyboard. See this dotted line appearing around? That's for certain situations and certain ways of browsing. So we'd also, as well as hover, you'd typically have a style for focus. So you do ampersand focus and save. And now if we tab, you can see it highlights a color even on focus. So when you're doing like a hover effect, you'd usually pair it with a focus effect as well. So what I tend to do is call this hocus for, focus and hover. So in order to do this, again, without having to write and : hover and : focus and then your color, you can kind of make this part a mixin, if you will, the thing that you want to include content. So this is a specific way of selecting focus and hover. So instead of having to repeat yourself every time you want to remember this, we want to turn this into a mixin. So if we cut that for now and do include, and then we're going to call it hocus. And then instead of doing like we've done before, which is open and close parentheses and close like that, we're actually going to make it look more like a function. So we're going to say include hocus, we're going to pass it in nothing, but we're then going to open and close curly braces and put the content that we want in there. So now, inside of a mixin, how do we access this, the thing that we want? All we're doing is replacing the selector. So if we go to a mixin here, and we do @mixin, and we'll call it hocus, and here we'd want that. So then this is now, this section here, we want to include whatever's in here. So this, you access this part of the mixin by a special prefix @content. And if we save that and save this, let's see, we've got an error, undefined mixin hocus. Hocus mixin, theme mixin, that's not undefined. We do have the mixin in here as well, don't we? Yep. Is this theme trying to access the mixin, and we simply need to include it here? So yeah, because we're making use of the mixins in the theme, we need to include the file there as well. So now you can see we have this mixin used in this way. And again, just take a look at the CSS, and you will see here that it's basically done that same thing. It's converted the include hocus, basically replaced that with this, because this is the mixin. And when you include the mixin, all this gets replaced. So you call this include hocus, and you can effectively think of it as this gets copied and pasted into where we've said include, like this. And that the content gets replaced with what the content was, like this. So that's kind of what's happening there. It's replacing the the content with that value. So it's still a mixin, but all we've shown there is that you can use @content, and then inside of the include, instead of passing parameters like we did here, where it's pass parameters and then a semicolon, we've done like open curly braces and passed values in. And so you can use them in many different ways, and we'll make use of them as we're making CSS. But it just makes using CSS easier and cleaner. And at first, on a really small scale, like we're just starting out, you might think, well, look at all this now. We've got a base class, palettes, mixins, fonts, settings, themes, all this lot to boil down to a CSS file that's got just this in. And you'll be like, well, isn't it easier to just write this CSS? And similar to code, like when you're doing MVVM and you're doing other concepts where it seems more work in the first place for small output, the benefit of this is not for a really small CSS file. The benefit of this is when we have 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 plus lines of CSS, which you will. And now it's organized into a decent structure that we can add comments to, because we haven't added comments in this video, but we will, going forward. And it's all structured and clean, and you can flick through it and you can make use of variables. So the benefit of Sass is going to come as we now use it going forward. But I really just wanted you to get straight in with Sass, to not be afraid of it, to not think, I want to learn CSS first. If you watch the CSS Basics video, you know enough, and all you need to really know in order to then use Sass, because Sass is just the CSS, but it adds these abilities like variables, partial classes and importing them, mixins, which are kind of like functions. It just adds features to CSS. So hopefully this video has been useful at this early stage. But really I needed to do this video first, because the next video, I'll show you some software that I've written. Again, open source, free, anyone can do what they like with it, called DNA Web Engine. And you've seen us in this video doing this Sass thing and having to run this. And basically this DNA Web Engine I've got will then not require you to install Sass. You can simply run this, and this will, as well as doing the Sass, it will also allow us to move on to moving this HTML into a dynamic system where we get the same benefits. So we can do like includes and variables and functions and everything else in HTML. So it kind of is, the point of why I've made this DNA Web Engine is to At first I was amazed that nothing even existed that I wanted. So there's kind of the systems out there that try and add dynamic features to HTML, but they're all, in my eyes, they're not right. You either use their way of typing or you use HTML. They don't really just look like HTML and work nice and have all the features. Like Sass is good because it's still CSS. You're still just typing CSS and you're replacing values where you need them. But all the HTML side didn't really have anything like that. In my eyes, everything that they did wasn't close enough to HTML. I didn't feel like I was writing HTML and simply adding the benefits. So that's why I made this DNA web engine. So we'll use this in the next video. We'll then add this kind of Sass style dynamic features to HTML. And then we're ready to go. We've got a web engine that's going to generate our HTML and CSS content for us. We've got all the structure set up, and we can start actually making, what we'll do first is make like a responsive grid system to get the whole layout ready and do like a grid system. And then we can get into designing the real website. And we're going to pick, like I say, a website to design and go to completion with the whole thing. And then after that, we'll move straight onto this server, which is ASP.NET Core, that'll serve the Facetto Word application. So this series should come along fairly quickly. But now we've got all bar the DNA web HTML stuff for the next video. We will have all the base training done, and we can rapidly progress with then making the website. So again, like I say, hopefully this video is useful. I'm sure it will become more useful in the following videos when you start using CSS more. But it's important to do it this way around and to keep things organized. Any comments, again, leave them in the video and I'll get back to you.